Right, with managing editor Zachary Fillingham of Geopoliticalmonitor.com. And today we're going to be discussing the China-US trade deal, which seeks to resolve some of the ongoing trade conflict between China and the United States. So Zach, what's the latest in the China-US trade relations?
Okay, so lately we've had a series of indications that we're moving towards the end game. Most of these were disclosed by the Wall Street Journal in a recent article that revealed the status of the trade negotiations on various fronts. And also, in a wider sense, there are certain sort of political pressures that are coming to a head for President Trump, which is making people speculate that he'll be more inclined to move towards bringing trade negotiations to an end.
Okay, interesting. And perhaps for the benefit of our listeners, if you could expand a little bit on the history of this conflict and how it came about and what impact it's been having to date.
Okay, so basically, Chinese trade practices have been a problem in U.S. eyes for a long time. They've come up several times in United States political debates. Basically, every presidential candidate over the last decade or so has brought up Chinese trade practices, sort of done a little trade saber rattling, said that usually the threat is to revoke China's, well, actually, I guess the Clinton era threat was to revoke most favored nation status. And then there was the constant threat to label China a currency manipulator throughout the Obama years. And obviously, on the campaign trail, President Trump made China, or put China front and center, basically promising to rectify U.S.-China trade and boiling it all down to the United States' large trade deficit with China. And unlike his predecessors, President Trump actually followed through with the threats and instituted, as we know, I think about $350 billion worth of tariffs unilaterally on China. And China, of course, responded. However, given the nature of the U.S.-China trade relationship, more damage can be done by the U.S. side than the Chinese side because obviously China exports more to the United States, substantially more than the United States exports to China. And also, so just to touch down on a few of these reported disclosures of the current deal from the Wall Street Journal. Supposedly, the deal includes this is what we're on the brink. This is what supposedly the final deal is going to look like. There's going to be a rollback of tariffs. We don't know if that's going to go all the way to the pre-trade war levels or there's going to be some sort of intermediate point, maybe halfway. There's going to be a purchasing agreement for for China to buy substantial amounts of U.S. agricultural, and energy products. The number being floated is around $1.2 billion worth a year. There's going to be changes to China's investment laws that will reduce the foreign ownership limits and restrictions, particularly with regards to, well, not totally eliminate, but ease these restrictions, particularly with regard to Chinese banks, insurers, and management companies. There's also going to be changes to investment laws to try and reduce some of the forced technology transfer, which has been a long-standing complaint of not just the Trump administration, but again, the administrations that came before him. And one important point is that, and supposedly this is a hitch in the negotiations, the U.S. is insisting on a unilateral mechanism by which that it can reimpose sanctions should China be viewed as being in breach of the final agreement. And China is also insisting that the mechanism be a two-way street. So basically, both sides are... Basically, we might get a situation whereby either side can unilaterally reimpose tariffs under the auspices of just this trade deal. If their executive decides that the other side's in breach.
Interesting. So, if this proceeds as has been speculated, would this be considered a win for President Trump?
Um, I don't know. I mean, like, in a way, like I said before, President Trump stands out in the sense that he actually followed through with the threats, and that's definitely uh, that's a new thing. You know, from the very start of the trade war, U.S. goals have been a bit unclear, right? So it's hard to decide who wins and loses when you don't really know what the U.S. side was playing for in the first place. There has been a lot of goals thrown around by both members of the Trump administration and members of the media establishment and wonkdom in general. You know, some of these have been chaotic moonshots, like sort of uh, that would amount to fundamental restructurings of the Chinese economic system, like removing Chinese government subsidies to state-owned enterprises. That's like a fundamental aspect of Chinese capitalism as it currently exists, right? It's going to be hard to impose that from the outside, particularly given the increasingly nationalist mood within China. That was just never going to happen. Similarly, the Made in China 2025, which the Trump administration focused on initially, which is a sort of broad program of subsidies by the Chinese government to various technological industries to try to create homegrown homegrown technology capacity in a variety of fields and sectors that the government has deemed critical. And obviously, a lot of these sectors are going to end up competing with U.S. and European companies, you know, semiconductors and chips, advanced technology, stuff like that. That probably was never going to happen. I mean, you might get some sort of symbolic act of contrition, some outward symbolic act of contrition from the Chinese government on this. Like they'll change the name of the program, but in substance, that's just like they're going to continue doing that, and there's really nothing that the United States can do about it, in my opinion. But on the other hand, you might get some. Sorry, you might get some. Like, for example, there might be some changes in the licensing agreements that take place between joint enterprises, foreign and Chinese enterprises, that will reduce the instances of technology transfer. That could be considered a win. Of course, the end of the trade war in general is going to be a quote unquote win, because no matter what the deal is, it's going to boost stock markets in the United States. And obviously, like, President Trump has proven very, very focused on this as a metric of success. In his public statements, he's saying, he's bigging it up as, we're going to get a very big spike in the stock markets. It's going to be great, et cetera, et cetera. So it's definitely going to appear to be a win in the immediate aftermath of a deal being announced. But I don't know if it's really. And another thing, like, for example, the IP law. So obviously, another initial goal of the United States was greater protections within Chinese IP law. And we're going to get them. We're going to get greater protections to a certain degree in Chinese IP law. Those reforms have been revealed in the 2 sessions, which are going on in Beijing right now. But, I mean, that arguably was going to happen anyways, because as as the intellectual property and the proprietary technology of Chinese companies improves over time, they were going to be pushing for a legislative and judicial environment that protects their own IP vis-a-vis foreign competitors. So that was going to happen. It was just a question of time. So is that a win? I'm not sure. Um, I don't know. I don't want to say it's a loss, but it was definitely a bit of a Herculean task to begin with. As we know, this sort of strange and symbiotic relationship between China and the United States in an economic sense has been going on decades. It's not for decades. It's not perfect. It's definitely deeply flawed, particularly in the antiquated notion that it was going to lead to Chinese democracy. Like, I think that ship has sailed. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's a loss because there are definitely some things he's going to get, but I don't want to say it's a win either. Maybe, oh yeah, okay, so let's say it's a draw.
And as you mentioned, Zach, there have been trade disputes between China and the United States for many, many years now that arise from time to time. Uh, Looking at this from a more historical context, is this just a minor bump in the road, or is this more significant than previous disputes?
I wouldn't say it's a bump in the road. I actually think it's pretty decisive in a couple of different ways. Obviously, I think that, as I said before, the Trump administration's posture towards China has been markedly different from predecessors. And even if this deal is agreed on, I don't think that I think that the cat's a bit out of the bag on this one. I think that the U.S.-China relationship has been substantively altered. And I think that subsequent administrations in the United States, to a certain degree, are going to be operating in this new normal. Like, some of the illusions about China have been dispelled. Like I said, the first and foremost, the illusion that China is moving towards some sort of benign democratic liberal order. I think that, like, the China we see is the China we get, and that China is going to be expanding into its sort of immediate geopolitical space, and that's going to have all sorts of consequences for U.S. strategic thinking. And and China's going to become more of an economic competitor in the higher rungs of technological development, like the sort of economic high grounds that the United States and to a lesser degree Europe, or I guess, yeah, the United States and Europe to this point have dominated. So basically, if you were to sort of recast the Trump administration as the waking up of the United States to the fact that China is a real strategic competitor, I think that's going to be the legacy of this. And to another, there's no going back, and this conflict might not solve all of the sort of long-standing problems in the trade relationship. However, it might alter how they're dealt with in the future, right? Like, we might return to it. I think, long story short, it'll be far easier to return to this sort of confrontational footing in the future than it was now. This may be sort of the new normal in trade relations between the United States and China. And another interesting thing about this, another legacy that this whole episode might produce, is that it's another big step away from the sort of post-World War II U.S. Global order in a couple of different ways. I mean, two big ways, really. The purchasing agreement, like the agreement that you basically sign China on to buying billions worth of U.S. agricultural products and energy products. Like, that's anti-free trade, right? That's a contractual obligation between two sort of two great power states, right? The sort of the theory we're fed about the global liberal free trade order is that basically everybody is supposed to play by the same rules, and through competition, the ones with competitive advantage are supposed to prevail, like the ones with either geographic, resource, technological, whatever your advantage is, it reflects in pricing, and you're able to sell your products, right? This totally runs in the face of that. And not only that, like, that's just maybe a sort of theoretical point, but this agreement is going to divert trade, right? So the China's going to buy agricultural products from the United States, and it was buying these agricultural products right now from other states that arguably had a competitive advantage because that's why they were being purchased. Um, in theory, air quotes, right? Because sometimes there are political aspects. That's a purely economic view of global trade, right? We're in an era now where there's an increase in political aspects to global free trade. Current case in point is the fact that China suddenly stops buying Canadian canola, right? It's not because of any sort of competitive notion. It's because of the two countries' ongoing political dispute. So back to my original point, this is going to divert trade. And interestingly, in many cases, it diverts trade away from longtime U.S. allies like Australia, Japan, etc. So, I mean, like, yes, this is more quote unquote America first, sure, but it's also more of a breakdown of the conventional sort of regional, US led regional order, right? It's more of every man for himself in East Asia. So, in that sense, I mean, I don't know if China is sort of like thinking about it in terms like this, but in that sense, it is a win for China because Chinese strategic thinking has been all about how to sort of drive wedges into this previously ironclad US-led alliance system in Asia, you know, that has Japan, South Korea, Australia, sort of hedging Chinese power in. It's surrounding China. And stuff like this, I mean, yeah, technically, is it a loss? It's not a loss to China, right? This is, sure, we'll buy American goods at the expense of your friends, create political animosity between, you know, previously very close allies. That's a sort of side win for China. And the other thing is this. In the sort of mechanism that's being set up here for the unilateral reimpositions of sanctions, if the decision is made that the other side is breaching the agreement, this is very sort of touch and go and very different from what we've come to expect from global free trade regimes. So global free trade regimes are supposed to operate as some sort of pseudo-judicial system, right? It's supposed to be detached, objective. It's supposed to be purely regulatory, not favoring one country over the other. It's supposed to have an appeal system, and all of this is to create the idea that the system is not favoring one country over the other, and that basically everyone buys into the rules, and then like the rules, you know, basically everyone can benefit from accepting these common rules, right? So this kind of agreement goes above the WTO, which has its own sort of arbitration dispute regulation mechanism and a whole set of very complex rules of what, when and what can be done in terms of applying tariffs on a certain good or service. It goes through that. So it basically sidelines the authority of the WTO, which is something that America created and championed for 50 years. Not only that, it creates it puts all the power supposedly in the hands of the executive in the United States, which allows for, in the future, these tariffs to be reapplied in a very capricious and, you know, arbitrary way, potentially, depending on who the executive is, right? So it just basically creates more of a possibility of sequels of this trade war because it creates it makes it easier for anyone in power in the United States and maybe to a lesser degree China to just throw up the tariffs again. And for, you know, some people might be saying, well, Trump threw up the tariffs in the first place, so who cares? That was obviously a huge breach of global trade law itself. So,
Zach, how much of this do you think is reflective of the respective administrations, and how much is just the time that we are in history and the changing power dynamic between China and the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's I think it's a lot of it has to do with that changing power dynamic. I mean, in a way, the whole trade war is a bit of old world thinking on the part of the Trump administration, especially if they believed that they'd be able to get some of the bigger concessions, the ones I was talking about before, like you know, removing support for SOEs and canceling Made in China 2025, like that sort of thing. That's just not going to happen because like we're at the point now where the United States just doesn't have that kind of leverage over China. And interestingly, like talking about the changing power dynamics in a systemic sense, like obviously the power dynamics have changed. America is still the unrivaled hegemon of the world in a military sense, right? Like no one comes close. China's getting closer, but still quite far away. But in an economic sense, we're definitely moving towards multipolarity or at least towards something more resembling multipolarity. And history has shown that military follows closely on economic when we have these kinds of global power shifts. But interestingly, like all of these moves, you know, their ultimate effect is going to be to quicken the movement towards multipolarity. It's like I was just talking about the sort of unraveling of the U.S. alliance system in East Asia. Like these are self-inflicted wounds when it comes to projecting U.S. global power, right? So you can have a debate whether the United States needs to be this global hegemon, whether it needs to have this sort of neo-colonial influence and presence all in the world, et cetera, et cetera. You can have this debate, fine. Interesting debate. But if you accept that, like if you are a proponent of U.S. global power and U.S. hegemony, it is hard to deny the fact that all of these moves, all of this dismantling of the U.S. led order under the banner of America First is sort of quickening the process of multipolarity. So in a sense, even if China looked at this trade war and said we lose, I think they're also aware that they're winning in the sort of broader sense.
Interesting. And will that likely play an influence in a willingness to concede minor points?
I think they're okay. So there were points that they were never going to concede, and there are points that they would very much be willing to concede because, you know, when this whole trade war started, there's this interesting academic debate between like, okay, so this is kind of a war between two systems, right? On one hand, you have the Chinese government, which is obviously insulated from political criticism in its own country, since it's like the communist authoritarian government, right? It can essentially ignore public opinion to a certain degree, right? So it can wait out. In theory, it can wait out the United States because there's way more popular pressure on the Trump government as a democratic government than there is on the Chinese government. And those economic pressures that turn into political pressures, from the very first, they were evident in the United States in the $12 billion subsidy program that President Trump had to set up and distribute to American farmers, which is still being roundly criticized as being inadequate, right? So from the start, the Chinese leadership knew that time was on their side. And I think for the most part, that has remained true, except for the fact that China's running into some economic headwinds that are largely unrelated. They're largely cyclical. And it finds itself right now on the top of a growing mountain of debt and unable to sort of turn on the previous stimulus open the previous stimulus floodgates that it used to. It's staring down a 6% growth target for the coming year. So it has a little bit of, so, you know, like, because the CCP is not totally removed from matters of legitimacy. In fact, the CCP is incredibly anxious about its own political legitimacy in China. it's overactive, right? So it definitely responds to particularly the idea that CCP rule is not producing economic opportunities, right? It's very sensitive to economic contraction, economic crisis, these sorts of things. So lately, with these sort of cyclical economic pressures, you had a bit of pressure on the CCP where I'd think, okay, sorry, the CCP is Chinese Communist Party, where the Chinese leadership would think, okay, maybe we'll give a bit more than we normally would. However, on the other side of the equation, there have been political developments in the United States, which have obviously the Cohen testimony and the collapse of the North Korea summit. And most recently, we're seeing North Korea start to prepare for another rocket launch. Apparently, that's the latest news. So that's going to kick up again as a high-profile failure of President Trump's diplomacy. Obviously, we've talked about it in previous podcasts. It may be unfair to attribute so much responsibility to the Trump administration when it comes like the situation it inherited on the Korean Peninsula was largely untenable. But so we have these new political pressures on the American side of the equation, and like the Chinese government is very intelligent, apt, clever. Like they're dialed in. They know what's going on in U.S. politics, and by now they have a pretty good bead on sort of what motivates President Trump as an individual and as a president. So I think that they might even sort of start to play a bit of hardball now and be less willing to give up what they were before, because all of a sudden it looks like, and again, this is the difference in the systems, right? All of a sudden it looks like President Trump is a lot more politically vulnerable than he was 3 months ago, and in need of a win.
Fascinating. So is there anything else you want to add, Zach, before we wrap up?
No, just that we're going to have a bunch of articles on China coming up, and explore some interesting aspects of the Chinese political system that not a lot of people know
And
about.
to our listeners, you can also check out on Geopoliticalmonitor.com the posted article, U.S.-China Trade Deal Takes Shape. So thanks to everyone for listening, and looking forward to next time. Talk to you then.